Hey guys, in today's video I bring you an unbelievable story full of twists and turns. Let's meet Vesper Calloway, a skeptical scientist who literally died on the operating table after a ruptured ectopic pregnancy and came back with an experiment that challenged her entire worldview. For 6 minutes she was outside her own body, floating above the operating room, witnessing her own death and being transported to a space beyond human comprehension. What she saw on the other side and the message she received will leave you speechless. So before we start, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this, and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Now get ready for this intense and transformative journey. My name is Vesper Calloway, and if you had asked me a few years ago if I believed in life after death, I would have laughed in your face. Not because I like to mock other people's beliefs, but because my life was based on logic, science, data that could be measured, tested, and reproduced. Everything needed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, including human consciousness. When the brain shut down, that was it. Game over. I worked for DARPA, an environment in which questioning everything was the rule. My day-to-day life was made up of exhaustive meetings with generals, scientists, and engineers who were planning the future of national security. I focused on artificial intelligence algorithms, mathematical models to predict behavior patterns, and there was no room for something as abstract as spirit. For me, consciousness was just the result of electrical impulses and neuronal synapses, nothing more. But then I died. I'm not talking about a symbolic experience, an emotional rebirth, or something metaphorical. My heart stopped. My brain ran out of oxygen. During 6 minutes, there was nothing in me that worked, but I was there. This story is not about blind faith, nor about conversion. I didn't become a spiritual guru or reject science, but I also could no longer ignore what happened. Because the moment I left my body, the moment I looked at my corpse on the operating table, something inside me broke. And ironically, the first thing I thought when I saw my own dead body was, "That sucks." My body started showing signs of failure weeks before it all happened, but, like a good skeptic and rationalist, I ignored it. At first it was light, irregular bleeding, something that could be explained by stress or any other hormonal factor. My life was a mess, a marriage that was no longer anything more than a forced coexistence, a growing dependence on alcohol to anesthetize me from reality, and a job that demanded more of me than I could give. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. The human body can be incredibly stubborn, but it lets you know when it's breaking down. I just chose not to listen. "You have to go to the doctor," he said. Samuel Archer, one of the few friends I still had at DARPA. "It's just a hormonal imbalance," I replied. "You've been bleeding for weeks, Vesper. This is not normal." "Oh, please. If it was something serious, I would have died already." Funny how some words come back to haunt us. The night it all happened, I was in the kitchen at home, holding a glass of wine in my hand, staring at my reflection in the window glass. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My thoughts were far away, wandering between work and regrets when a sharp pain cut through my abdomen like a blade. The cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. My body reflexively doubled over, and within seconds I was on my knees. The air felt heavier and my heart sped up as if it wanted to escape my chest. I tried to get up, but my legs were weak. A cold sweat ran down my forehead. I screamed my husband's name, no response. I was alone. I groped for the counter, trying to support myself, but everything around me started to spin. The kitchen became a shapeless blur of colors and shadows. My body no longer responded. Then came darkness. Darkness was not the end. It was a limbo. I didn't know if I was sleeping or dying. My consciousness fluctuated between disconnected states of perception. I felt the weight of my body, and, at the same time, I felt nothing. I heard distant noises, confused echoes of voices, as if they were submerged in water. That was when a sharp, brutal pain ripped through my abdomen from the inside out. An electric shock seemed to run down my spine, pulling me back to a minimal level of consciousness. My chest rose and fell in uncoordinated spasms. "Pressure dropping," someone shouted. My eyelids were too heavy to open, but the words reached me. I didn't know where I was, but the unmistakable smell of antiseptic and the hum of equipment gave me a clue. A hospital. I tried to speak, but my lips wouldn't obey. My entire body was distant, as if it belonged to someone else. She lost. A lot of blood. Liter and a half, maybe 2. We need to stabilize her before we take her into surgery. The voices were increasingly distant, as if someone was slowly turning down the volume on the world. My mind wandered between fragments of memory and lapses of unconsciousness. My eldest daughter's face, Natalie, appeared before me. She was sitting at her college desk surrounded by books. I could see the fluorescent light illuminating his dark hair. But how? She was 200 miles away. The scene faded, and suddenly, I saw my youngest daughter, Ivy, sitting on the floor of a children's waiting room playing with colorful blocks. She was fine. An inexplicable relief washed over me. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Something inside me said everything was right. Then one last sentence crossed my consciousness before the final void. We lost our pulse. Darkness swallowed me. There was a snap, not an audible sound but a sensation, as if something invisible had broken inside me. The next moment I was no longer there. My body, that collapsed heap of flesh and bones, was still on the operating table, but it floated above the room, weightless, without body. There was no gradual transition, no advance warning. 1 second I was inside the pain, the desperate fight for life, and the next I was an observer. I saw the doctors and nurses moving frantically around my body. The words "cardiac arrest" echoed amid the chaos. Someone applied pressure to my chest. Someone was shouting for the defibrillator. There was urgency in those gloved hands, but none of it seemed to belong to me anymore. My first reaction was something surprisingly banal. That sucks. No despair, no fear, just a dry, sarcastic thought. I moved through the air effortlessly. My consciousness seemed expanded, without the physical limits of the body. There was no pain, no feeling of being trapped, just a slight curiosity about what would come next. That's when I heard it. She was already weak. Alcohol abuse compromised the liver, which complicated the bleeding. The voice of Dr. Elias Hawthorne. Something inside me reacted. The alcohol, the judgment in those words. If I were alive, I would have been furious. But there, in that state, I felt nothing more than a brief discomfort, as if the information didn't really matter. My gaze, or whatever it was that allowed me to see, wandered around the room, registering every detail with impossible clarity. The equipment, the doctors' faces, the cold glow of the surgical lights, my own body inert, pale, expressionless. The reality was clear. I was dead. And yet I still existed. The thought should have terrified me. But strangely, it wasn't terrifying, because deep down I knew that it wasn't the end. The hospital disappeared. There was no warning, no gradual transition. One moment I was observing my own body, and the next I was in a completely different place. It wasn't a tunnel, nor a dark void. It wasn't a starry sky or a field of flowers either. It was hard to describe. The best way I can explain it is that I was in a space without borders, no floor, no walls. A golden white light filled everything around me, but there was no visible source for this light. She simply existed. And then I noticed something even stranger. You didn't have a body. My consciousness hovered, expanded. I had no arms, legs, face, nothing. But at the same time, I was bigger than I had ever been, as if he was everywhere at once. My vision was impossible. I saw in all directions at the same time. If I wanted to look back, I didn't need to turn around, because back and front didn't exist. Everything was within my reach in any direction my mind wanted to perceive. I should be terrified, but it wasn't. The panic, the pain, the fear, All of it belonged to the physical world. There, in that space of light, there was only acceptance. But I wasn't alone. There was something there with me. I didn't see anyone, but I felt it. A presence, various presences. It wasn't like being surrounded by people, but like other consciousnesses. Were nearby, watching, waiting. They didn't speak, but I knew they were there. And it was at that moment that I noticed a silhouette appear in front of me. It was not a celestial figure, an angel, or some deceased relative. Was myself. Or at least a version of me. She looked at me, but her eyes were different. There was a deep knowledge in that expression, something I couldn't decipher. Then, without moving your lips, she spoke inside my mind. A single word. Nope. No. No what? Before I could ask, I was sucked back with impossible force. The feeling was indescribable. My body, or whatever my consciousness was pulled back with a force that defied all logic. There was no wind, there was no resistance, but the speed was overwhelming. Everything distorted around me. The golden light began to fragment into glowing particles, dissolving as I was, sucked back. My perception narrowed, no longer immense, no longer seeing in all directions at once. It was as if I was being squeezed back into something too small to contain me. And then came the pain. It wasn't just physical pain. It was an absolute pain. As if every molecule of my being was being forced to fit back into a tiny space, as if I were being compressed back into my own flesh. It was at that moment that I realized where I was entering. By the navel. My consciousness descended in a beam of energy that collided directly with the center of my abdomen. It was searing pain, a shock that made every nerve in my body scream at once. My spine arched, my lungs tried to suck in air they hadn't been getting for minutes. And then, I went back. My eyes opened at once. My body jerked up as if it had been electrocuted. My mouth opened in a desperate gasp, pulling air into my lungs like someone who almost drowned and managed to breathe at the last second. And what I saw when I woke up was pure terror in the eyes of doctors. The operating room was motionless. Everyone stared at me. Dr. Hawthorne was pale as a ghost, his clipboard almost falling out of his hands. The nurse next to him let out a choked scream. The other professionals were simply paralyzed, as if they were facing something that shouldn't be happening. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. Still, I forced out the words. I heard everything you said. The shock in the room was absolute. Hawthorne took a step back as if I were a ghost. And in a way, maybe I was. The silence in the operating room was deafening. I was sitting on the operating table, breathing hard, feeling my heart racing inside my chest. My body still felt strange, as if I had been dumped into something tight and uncomfortable. My muscles were shaking, my skin felt cold, and a ringing filled my ears. But none of that mattered as much as the expressions of the doctors around me. Dr. Hawthorne seemed terrified. His eyes were wide, his face completely pale. The nurse next to him had one hand over her mouth, unable to say anything. He was the one who broke the silence. That is not possible. There was incredulity in his voice, but also genuine fear. The other doctors were frozen, some still holding surgical instruments, as if time had frozen at the exact moment they saw me return. I stirred, trying to understand what the hell was happening to me. My abdomen burned, my extremities were numb, but the strangest thing was the feeling inside my mind, as if something had reconfigured. It was then that I remembered what I had heard before I died. I heard you talking about my liver. My voice came out rough, scratchy. Dr. Hawthorne opened and closed his mouth, not knowing what to say. You thought I wouldn't come back, didn't you? My own sentence scared me. I didn't seem desperate or confused. I looked right of what he was saying. Hawthorne took a deep breath, seeming to finally regain some of his professional composure. Vesper, you were dead. I blinked as if I needed a second to absorb this. But I already knew. How long? He hesitated. The other doctors exchanged looks. It was a nurse who responded, 6 minutes. I absorbed the information. 6 minutes without a heartbeat. 6 minutes without oxygen to the brain. And yet, I was here. Viva. But something inside me knew that it wasn't the same person who died at that table. Returning to life was not a celebration. There was no epiphany, no tears of gratitude. What came was a strange, disconnected sensation, as if the world around me was slightly out of tune. I was transferred to the ICU a few hours later, while the doctors tried to understand how on earth someone could just return from the dead no brain damage. But the truth was that the damage wasn't in my brain. It was in my perception of everything around me. The first sign that something was different came quickly. A nurse came into the room to change my IV, and as she approached, I felt a tingling in the fingers. Something like an invisible electric field passing through me. I couldn't explain it, but I could to feel your presence in a way that was not possible before. Not just his physical presence, but his energy. She was exhausted. I knew it before I even looked at his face. She forced a smile and checked my heart monitor. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle but tired. The words came before I could hold them in. "You are sad." She blinked in surprise. What? I didn't know why I said that. But the information came from such a certain place inside me that I couldn't help it. Her smile faltered. "I am fine. You must be confused. You went through trauma." But you knew. It was like instant knowledge, a reading that didn't come from words or gestures but from something much deeper. The second sign came when my husband showed up at the hospital. He sat next to me, took my hand and feigned concern. And I knew. I knew at that exact moment that he didn't love me anymore. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a feeling. It was an absolute knowledge, as if someone had whispered the truth inside my mind. I looked at him, and for the first time in years realized that the void between us couldn't be repaired. And perhaps for the first time in my life, I accepted it without pain. Because now you knew that my path would be completely different, and nothing, nor anyone could hold me back to who I was before. My physical recovery was quick, but my mind no longer belonged to the same world as before. The doctors were surprised. I should have stayed in the hospital for weeks, but my body seemed to heal at an abnormal rate. The tests showed that my organs were working perfectly, without any collateral damage from blood loss or clinical death. It was as if I had never died. But you knew that something inside me had changed forever. My husband took me home on the third day, and that's when the transformation really began. The first shock came with alcohol. I opened a bottle of wine out of pure habit. My fingers brushed the glass, but before I could pour a glass, a shiver ran up my spine. My stomach dropped instantly. One ASCO visceral took care of me. I dropped the bottle on the table, backing away as if I were in the presence of something toxic. I tried again a few days later, thinking it was a side effect of the medication. The result was the same. The smell, the mere idea of alcohol, was unbearable. My body, I no longer accepted that. It was at that moment that I realized my NDE had not only shown me something beyond life, it had rescheduled. The second sign came when I went to pick up my daughter Ivy at school. She ran up to me laughing, but before I could hug her, felt the same electric feeling as before, but stronger. She didn't say anything to me, but the moment her hands touched mine, a whirlwind of emotions ran through my mind. She had a nightmare last night. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. Her face was cheerful, but a shadow of fear still lingered in her energy. "You dreamed about something bad, didn't you?" I asked, not knowing where I had gotten that from. Her eyes widened. "How do you know?" I swallowed hard. "Mom just knows." My daughter smiled, satisfied. But I stood there, feeling the weight of what had just happened. What was happening to me? What more had it changed? And most importantly, what should I do now? The answer came before I could even phrase the question correctly. Little by little, like pieces of an invisible puzzle, my life began to unfold. Realign yourself. The first big step came unexpectedly. Return to DARPA seemed unthinkable. I tried, but every time I sat in front of military reports, surveillance, algorithms, and artificial intelligence projects, I felt an absolute emptiness. It was like trying to fit a triangle into a circular space. Nothing else fit. And then, an email arrived. A school for young people in vulnerable situations needed temporary teachers for an experimental educational reintegration program. Before the NDE, I would have ignored it. I wasn't a teacher, but something inside me made me open that email, click on the application form, and apply. 2 months later, there I was, standing in front of a class of broken, rebellious, trauma-ridden teenagers. And for the first time in my life, I felt exactly where I was supposed to be. The students connected with me in ways I didn't expect. Maybe because after the NDE I could to feel what they carried. I knew when one of them was about to have an anxiety attack. I felt when a student was struggling with a violent past. But the biggest confirmation that my life had taken a definitive direction came years later, when I enrolled at university again. I started a master's degree, then a doctorate, psychology, consciousness studies. Science was still a part of me, but now, I used it to understand something much bigger than artificial intelligence and national security. My mind was focused on something I could never have predicted before I died. The question burning inside me was, what happens when we die? And most importantly, what happens when we come back? The answer to this question did not come from books or scientific theories. It came from inside me. My NDE was not an accident. You knew of it now. It wasn't just a biological glitch, a random event in the chaos of the universe. It was a redirection, a reboot. My life was out of control before this. I was trapped in a cycle of self-destruction that sooner or later would come to a definitive end. If I hadn't died on that operating table, maybe I would have died somewhere else in another way. But somebody, brought me back. And it was not a divine being. He was not an angel, nor a spiritual guide. He was myself. That version of me on the other side gave me a message that was as simple as it was definitive. Nope. It wasn't my time. That wasn't my path. Returning was not a punishment, but a calling. An opportunity to change, to break the cycles, to do something different. And so I did. It was no longer just science or spirituality. It was both. The intersection. The meeting point between what we can measure and what we can only feel. Little by little, my perception adjusted. I learned to control the sensations that used to overwhelm me. I learned to channel insights, to accept the downloads of information that sometimes simply appeared in my mind, complete, as if someone had inserted them there. I started helping other people. People who, like me, had gone through near-death experiences and didn't know how to deal with the transformation. People who felt they had come back different, but couldn't explain how. Now, it was my mission, my purpose. My NDE didn't take anything from me. She gave me everything. And I knew with absolute certainty that when my time truly came, I would recognize that place. But next time there wouldn't be a nope. There would only be the next step of the journey. If you like this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video, and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.